Hey guys, it's Courtney, and today I'm going to be using the Something to Squawk About stamp set by MFT. Went ahead and picked out some of the images from the stamp set, and I'm going to stamp these out onto some Simon Says stamp masking paper. I cut these down a little bit bigger than the image itself just to make the cutting a little bit easier for me. I don't have all of that excess paper hanging off the end and getting in my way. I cut the birds out pretty much, well, they don't have to be exact. In fact, I only really needed the bottom half cut as a mask, so I wasn't really all that careful with it. And as far as the leaves go, some of these leaves are super detailed. This one, I ended up cutting all of the little ins and outs of the leaf. And you'll see that I am just turning my paper with my left hand and kind of keeping my scissors pretty much straight as I do my cutting. This makes fussy cutting a little bit easier for me. Now, these don't have to be perfect because I'm not doing any ink blending in the background. You want to make sure that you're pretty precise with images as fussy cutting if you're doing ink blending in the background. But if you're just stamping images over one another, it doesn't have to be perfect. Now, for these other leaves that are super detailed, I didn't bother with all of the details. I just kind of cut the shape of the leaf. All of these little ins and outs that are on the side, I'm totally ignoring. I can always fix that with a pen later or my coloring, or just leave it as is, because if I don't notice it, the recipient of the card is probably going to notice it, not going to notice it either. And I have a ton of mistakes in this card. Tons. I'm rusty. I've been away from the game for a while, so I admit I'm pretty rusty. So I'm going to stamp these leaves along the left-hand side of my card panel. This is a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and I'm stamping them with Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is a Copic safe ink. So I'm going to stamp one, use the mask, stamp the next one, use the next mask, and go all the way down to the bottom of the panel. Now I'm reusing the masks that I have cut, just kind of moving them along as I go. You can cut multiple masks if that makes it easier for you, but really this isn't too detailed. There is not a whole lot of stamping and masking here, so I figured I can just move the mask as I go along. You do want to make sure that you're careful depending on what type of mask you're using. The Simon Says stamp is pretty tacky in the beginning, which is good because you can reuse it many times, but you do just want to be careful when you are removing it the first time, especially just because it's pretty stuck down there and can tear your paper if you're not careful. Now I am going to leave the middle masks on because I'm not really sure where I'm going to be stamping the branch. I didn't end up needing I only needed one mask, but at this point in the game, I wasn't really sure which one I was going to need or where I was going to be stamping it. So I left them in the middle, kind of in the middle. Now this is where I'm going to line up my birds and my branch. So I'm just taking my stamp there of the branch and my masks for the birds, and then realized I don't really trust myself too much with this stamping, especially when I can only stamp one bird at a time. So I ended up bringing out my mini Misty and lined everything back up using the stamps for the birds this time. Now here's another one of my errors. I should have stamped the bird that has his back towards us first, masked that out, stamped the branch, masked the branch out, and then stamped the bird that is facing us because the branch ended up going directly through that bird. But I'll fix it, kind of sort of fix it, hide it at least. There's going to be mistakes in anything that's handmade. It's just a matter of hiding it, hiding our mistakes. So I stamped the birds, lined up the branch, and placed my masks down for the birds. And this is when I realized I messed up. But I already did all of that stamping for the leaves, and I wasn't going to start over. I figured I'm just going to use really dark colors for the branch and hope that works. It didn't work, but I'll show you how I kind of disguised my mistake later on. So I took a Copic Safe pen. This is an EK Success journaling pen, which is not made anymore, but I will link something very similar below. It works the same way. And I kind of just finished off my branch. I just kind of drew it in there so that that will be my guide as far as where I need to color in that branch later on. remove the rest of the masks and we will move on to the coloring. I'm going to start with the leaves, and I'm going to mix some greens, some yellow greens, and even some yellows here. So I'm going to start off with my lightest color, and I'm just going to add that to what will be my darkest areas to kind of map out that area, but also to get the paper saturated. Once the paper is saturated, you'll find that your colors will blend a little bit easier. Next, I'm going in with the darkest color, and I'm just going to add a little bit of that to the middle of the leaf. Then blend that out. You'll notice that I used a G marker for the darkest color, and then I'm going to switch over to the YG markers. You'll also notice that the G marker was a 28 and this is a 67. So I want to make sure that when I'm switching from one color family to the other, I want to make sure that that last number is either the same or maybe one, possibly two off if you're very familiar with the colors of Copics that you have and you already know what works with what. Now, going from the greens to the YGs or the yellow greens isn't too far off. They're basically all greens anyway. So this didn't really have an issue blending regardless of what number I was using. I ended up bringing in a YG03, just a little bit lighter than what was originally going to be my lightest color, just because I felt like there wasn't quite enough contrast for me, and finished off the tips of those little pieces of that leaf. Now, all of the little sections, I guess, I was trying to go around them, but then ended up just kind of forgetting it. I'll fix that with a white gel pen later on, just because it was too hard to go around those little tiny spaces. Next, moving on to this leaf here, I started off with what I was going to use and realized right away I was not going to have enough contrast. So I ended up bringing in a G17 for my darkest color, just so that I can get that contrast and I actually have a nice gradient from the base of the leaf all the way up to the tip. So for the second one of the same identical leaf, but for the second one, I kind of knew what colors I wanted to use, being I had to add in that darkest one. So this one made it a little bit easier because I didn't have to go over it too many times because I automatically went in with that darker color. Finally, finishing off with this last leaf that has a whole lot of detail to it, but it was actually the easiest one to color out of all of them because it didn't have any little openings in the middle. But I am going to bring in some green markers again, but this time I am going to use a yellow marker for my lightest. So I'm switching my color family completely. So once again, I'm going to start with that yellow. That's my lightest color to get the paper saturated a little bit. I'm going to start off with a G marker in the center, which is the G09. Then I'm going to switch over to the YG. So I'm switching color families, but it's a YG17. So I'm not too far off from the 9 to the 7. Then I'm going to move on to a lighter YG. So I'm keeping with the same color family at this point. And then I am going to finish off with a yellow. And I'm going to move from the tip back. So each of these little areas, I'm going to move from the outer edge of it towards the greens, if that makes any sense. Just makes the blending a little bit easier. Next, I can go in with that white gel pen to fix up all of these mistakes. All of these, well, I can't even call them mistakes because I didn't even try to avoid them. So I would say my laziness. I'm going to fix up those areas and nobody will ever know the difference. Next, I'm going to move on to the branch that the birds are sitting on, and I'm going to use some E50 markers. So I'm starting off with my lightest one, kind of mapping out where the darkest areas which will be kind of on the bottom part of the branch. Then go in with the darkest color, which is the E59, which is a pretty dark brown. And at this point, I'm hoping that it will cover up the lines that you can see from the one bird. Once I start going over it with the E57 and back to that E55, I realize that it's not covering it up. The E59 did a pretty good job, but it's just not quite dark enough. And I didn't want to color it solid because then I would have no contrast. So I ended up bringing back in my pen, my Copic Safe pen, and I kind of just added lines. And this will add a little bit of texture to the branch, but it will also disguise it a little bit. You can still see it, but unless you look close, it's not going to be as noticeable. So I Googled some pictures of macaws because I figured that's how I'm going to color these. And they are a whole lot of different colors. And I'm going to start off with the white areas and the black areas. Their beaks are white on the bottom, or no, white on the top and black on the bottom, or like a very dark gray. So I want to kind of use a gradient for that. And around their eyes is kind of white. So I'm using just some cool grays just to add a tiny bit of shading, but I'm not too concerned with this area. It's not really going to be all that noticeable once we have all of the bright colors added. For the beak, I am adding just a little bit of a shadow where the bottom portion meets the top portion, just so that you can tell the difference. Because when you're using such a dark color as a C7, it's hard to tell where you actually stamped. So I want to make sure that I'm adding a shadow there, so that way you can differentiate between the two portions of their beaks. Next, I'm going to move on to all of the colors. And these are all of the colors that I'm going to use. Notice the last number for all of these. They're all the same, or maybe one off from one another. That way, when I'm moving from one color family to the other, I will hopefully get a good blend. Now, there were some areas where I didn't, and I ended up having to bring in another color. And I wish I probably should have colored one of these off, like besides the card, just kind of as a practice one, so then I would know what colors that I should have used, because the second one certainly came out better than the first. But I started with my reds, and I'm just using some flicking motions, and I'm moving from my reds to my orange to my yellows, kind of just in the color of the rainbow. Even though the orange is not noticeable in the bird itself when I Googled pictures, I use that more of a transition color. Same thing for this BG marker. I'm using it more as a transition from the green to the blue, just to get a better blend. You don't have to do that. You can jump right from green to blue, but I find this a little bit easier. Now I am going to add some darker blues towards the bottom just to have a little bit more contrast, because there's a whole lot of blue to these birds. So I want to have a little bit more contrast in that blue section, and then I'm going to work my way back up. So I worked my way down, and now I'm going to work my way back up, kind of like I do with ink blending. If you've ever watched any of my previous videos, you'll know that I go over my ink blending twice. And that way the paper is nice and saturated, and the colors just seem to blend a little bit easier that way. The same thing with alcohol marker coloring. The more saturated the paper is, the better they're going to blend. There is a happy medium there. You want to make sure that you're not oversaturating so that you don't have any bleeding. So I am going to add a little bit of shading to his head as well, because that is a kind of a larger area too, and I don't want to color it all in one solid red. So I ended up bringing in a little bit of a contrast there. I ended up here also bringing in a little bit more of that orange, trying to get that area to blend. Didn't really have great luck, but in the second bird I do. So you'll see me kind of go back and forth a little bit with that. So here I'm going to add a little bit of that scary dark red to the very top of his head and blend that out with a R46, and then move back to that R24 that is part of the rest of it, or I guess a majority of it, I should say. So now I'm going to show you the second bird, even though it's very similar, but you'll see me bring in other colors, and he's facing us. So his body is different than his tail, if that makes any sense. So we're going to change it up a little bit, but it's still going to be the same colors that I'm using and in the same order. But this time I'm going to start from the bottom up. So I'm going to start with that really dark blue and use the mid-tone blue, the lighter blue, the BG marker, same thing as I did before. But I'm not going to go all the way up here, because I want it to kind of have a little bit of separation from the body, from the tail, because the tail is actually behind him. It's just hanging below the tree. You'll also notice that I'm not doing any shadowing. I'm not worried about a light source here. I'm not adding any of that to it, because I'll be quite honest with you, I haven't picked up a Copic marker in months. So I'm very rusty. I figured that out. It was like the first time I was ever holding these markers, it seemed like. So I wanted to keep things pretty simple, but challenge myself just a little bit by bringing in different color families. So for the body, I'm going to start off with the yellow and then move to that orange and that R24, which is the red. Now this orange, even though the last number was the same as the yellow, I just was not getting a good transition from the orange to the yellow. So I ended up bringing in a different yellow, and just because I'm very familiar with the colors that I have, I know kind of what blends with what, even if the last number isn't the same or similar. So I ended up bringing in, I believe it was a Y17, which is pretty off, but it's more of it has more of an orange tone to it. It's a much darker yellow, and I found that that ended up blending with the yellow much, much better than that first orange that I had. So once again, I'm going to add a little bit of shading to the top of his head with that scary dark red and blend that out with the R46. I didn't saturate this area because reds tend to bleed a lot, and I didn't want to oversaturate the paper and risk it bleeding, because even with a white gel pen, reds are very hard to cover up. So I went back and added a little bit of that Y17 to the first bird. Now, once you go over a darker area with a lighter color, it's going to act as a colorless blender, so you just have to be careful you don't oversaturate there. Going to finish off with a sentiment and stamp that with some VersaFine Onyx Black ink, and that is it. Very simple today. I got to work my way back up, guys, but thanks so much for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.